Now we want to start talking about each prayer with detail one by one. So let's go over the noon prayer and we'll see. Maybe that's what we'll do for today, or if Allah will for us to do more. So the author says noon prayer. Noon prayer is called Dhuhr. Dhuhr means noon. Yani the Dhuhr time, the noon time. But exactly noon, real exact noon is zenith. It's called Dhuhr because it is Zahira, obvious, at midday. It is also called Hajira prayer, Hajira prayer, Salatul Hajira, very hot time prayer, because that's going to be the hottest time of the day, if it's a hot day. It was also called As-Salatul Ula, the first prayer. It is the first of the 5 prayers insinuated. Insinuated means not explicitly mentioned by God's word in Surah Al-Isra, Ayah 78. أقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس إلى غسق الليل. أقم الصلاة. There should be a kasra on this meme here. أقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس إلى غسق الليل وقرآن الفجر إن قرآن الفجر كان مشهودا. Observe every prayer. أقم الصلاة. Observe every prayer. لدلوك الشمس إلى غسق الليل. So every prayer, the noon, the afternoon, the sunset, and nightfall prayers, from the sun's declining from its zenith. Liduluki shams, from the sun's declining from its zenith. So that's Dhuhr time. Ila ghasaqil layl, until the approach of the night's darkness. Wa Qur'an al-Fajr, and observe the Quran in the dawn prayer, the recitation of the Quran. Inna Qur'an al-Fajr kana mashhuda. Surely the recitation of the Quran in the dawn prayer is witnessed by the angels of the day and the angels of the night who change shifts. You know, there are angels, they change shifts on us. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned them in the hadith. يَتَعَاقَبُونَ فِيكُمْ مَلَائِكَةُ اللَّيْلِ وَمَلَائِكَةُ النَّهَارِ. There are angels of the day that are on duty with you, and then they get replaced by angels of the night. And every day and night, there are angels changing shifts on us. Why are we mentioning those angels? Because it's part of the tafsir of the ayah. Inna Qur'an al-Fajr kana mashhuda. Surely the recitation of the Quran in the dawn prayer is witnessed by the angels who change shifts on us. So Dhuhr prayer was the first prayer insinuated in this ayah. وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِدُلُوكِ الشَّمْسِ. Observe the prayer when the sun declines. That's Dhuhr time. And it was also the first of the 5 prayers that the Prophet ﷺ prayed. He said, like we already took, أمني جبريل عليه السلام عند البيت مرتين. Gabriel led me at the house twice. فصلى بي الظهر حين زالت الشمس. He prayed Dhuhr with me when the sun declined. When the sun declined, you know what that means. It means the sun in the first place rises from the east. So if it's declining, means it's going down. So declines from where? Declines from its highest point, which is the zenith. So the zenith is the sun's highest point of the day. It won't go higher. So if it's not going to go higher, that means it's not going to do anything but go lower. So it's going to decline. So as soon as the sun declines out of its zenith, that's when Dhuhr time starts. And whoever studies will count Dhuhr having 5 blocks of time, like other prayers. Why it says whoever studies? Because they're not listed here by number. First time is this, second time is this, third time is this. But if you study, if you look into the information that's presented here and you pull it apart and you sift through it, then you're going to find that there's 5 blocks of time. Dhuhr starts when it appears that the sun declined westward from its zenith, not in reality. When it appears that the sun declined westward from its zenith, not in reality. Well, what does that mean, not in reality? It means in reality, the sun will have declined out of its zenith before it appears to us. Dhuhr time doesn't start until the sun's declination out of its zenith appears to us. Because the sun is always moving, it's not stopping. So we will not perceive that it came out of its zenith when it really did. And by the time we do perceive that it came out of its zenith, it will have already been out of its zenith. And same thing for other issues like Fajr, like we're going to say. You know, Fajr is the white light across the horizon in the east. Across the horizon, not up into the sky, across. So, even if you just waited to see Fajr, by the time you notice, you say, all right, it's in, I see it. By the time you notice that Fajr's in, really the dawn already started. Just doesn't appear to us yet. So these prayer times, they start when the sign appears to us. Now we're saying appears to us because we're taking more details now. But when you first learned, you didn't hear when it appears to us, you just learned when the sun declines westward from its zenith. But to be more exactly, when it appears to us that the sun declined westward from its zenith, because it's going to have declined westward from its zenith before it appears to us. As in Sharh al-Muhadhab, after every shadow was the shortest of the day. Dhuhr time starts after every shadow was the shortest of the day, because that's when the sun is at the highest point of the sky, or the highest point of the day. The sun is at the highest point of the day, that its zenith. That's its zenith. And so if the sun is as high as it's going to get that day, that means the shadows are as short as they're going to get that day. That means the zenith shadow is the shortest shadow of the day. Dhuhr time starts after the shadow is the shortest shadow of the day. It's the same as saying Dhuhr time starts after the sun declines from its zenith. Because when the sun rises from the east in the morning, the shadows will be very long. You notice that probably if you went out to go to school in the morning or went to work in the morning, shadows are nice and long. And then as the sun goes higher and higher, the shadows get shorter and shorter until the sun reaches its zenith. And when the sun reaches its zenith, yani, it's at its highest point of the day, and the shadows, since they get shorter and shorter as the sun rises higher and higher, then the shadows will be at their shortest point of the day because the sun won't go higher. So Dhuhr time starts after every shadow was the shortest of the day, which varies with season and location. What's the shortest shadow of the day? That depends on the season and the location. In the summer, the shadows are shorter. And in the winter, the shadows are longer. So the shortest shadow of the day in the winter is longer than the shortest shadow of the day in the summer. If any shadow remain, that is, because in some places, when the sun is at its zenith, there's no shadow. Then when the sun tilts out of its zenith, the shadow will begin again. So Dhuhr time will start. As usual, yani, usually there is a shadow when the sun is at its zenith. But it could be, depending on where you are, that when the sun is at its zenith, there is no shadow. So this means once the shadows tilt eastward, because the sun rises in the east, so that means the shadows are projected towards the west. So when the sun tilts over into the west, the shadows will turn into the east. Or otherwise reappear, meaning if it were the case that there's no shadow at zenith time, the Dhuhr time starts when the shadow reappears. So if there were no shadow at zenith, then I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. Then that means Asr time is going to start when the shadow is as long as the object. That's it. Asr time will start when the shadow is as long as the object because there was no shadow at zenith time. When does Asr start? The rule is when the shadow is as long as the object plus as long as the shadow was at zenith time. So if there's no shadow at zenith time, that means Asr will start when the shadow is as long as the object only. So that's when Dhuhr begins. Lil, which means shade or shadow, linguistically means sitr, cover. It is not a lack of sunlight, or it's not a lack of sun or a lack of light. The lil, the shade or the shadow, is not a lack of light, as one might imagine. Instead, it is an intangible substance. Yani, this means shade itself is made of particles. It's not the lack of light. You know, light is made of particles, atoms. So shade is not the lack of light, which would be a lack of the atoms that make light. It is itself something made of atoms, the shade. So it's an intangible substance, darkness, created for benefiting the body and for other things. And the shade or the shadow appears from daybreak until sunset. Yani, daybreak when the sun cracks the horizon, the shadows will start and they will persist all day until sunset. And when the shadow tilts, because the sun declines from its zenith, so that means the shadow tilts towards the east, because the sun rises in the east, projecting shadows into the west. When the sun is in the western side, it projects shadows into the east. So when the shadow tilts into the east, because the sun declines from its zenith, this is called fate. This shadow itself exactly is called fate because it swerved from one side to another. The shadow or the shade, the shadow swerved from one side, the western side, to the other side, the eastern side. It's going to be because the sun tilted. It rose from the east, reached its zenith, and then went into the west. It therefore, while rising in the east, projects shadows into the west, and then when it tilts into the west, projects shadows into the east. So when the shadow swerves to the other side, that's called fade. That's the word that the Prophet ﷺ used in the hadith about how Gabriel taught him the prayer times. When he said the shadow was as long as a sandal strap. This is the word he was using. The fade. The fade was as long as a sandal strap. So that makes us know that the sun went out of its zenith. Delaying this prayer until a time only enough to contain the prayer is still rewardable. We talked about that. Yani, this Dhuhr prayer, you are allowed to delay it all the way till the end of the time. Meaning, if you say Allahu Akbar, you could say Assalamu alaikum to end your prayer, and then the prayer time will go out right then, inside the prayer time. All of it. All of the prayer inside the prayer time. By the time you say Assalamu alaikum, prayer is over. This is not disliked for this prayer, Dhuhr prayer. Delaying this prayer until a time only enough to contain the prayer is still rewardable. Because of how Ash-Shafi'i interprets the Prophet's hadith, alayhi salatu wassalam, فَلَمَّا كَانَ الْغَدِ, when it was the next day, صلى بي الظهر حين كان ظله مثله. Gabriel, and this is the literal translation, Gabriel led me in Dhuhr prayer when the shadow was as long as the object that casts it. This means uh, after the zenith shadow. So this is another way of the Prophet saying he prayed Dhuhr with me at the end of the time. And the end of the time, he described it as the time when the shadow is as long as the object. That's Asr time. So then in this hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam named the Asr prayer by saying, let me, no. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he named the end of Dhuhr, the end of Dhuhr. He named the end of Dhuhr prayer by the description of how Asr starts. He named the end of Dhuhr by the description of how Asr starts here. So this proves that the end of a prayer time could be called the beginning of the next prayer. Al-Dhuhr remains until any shadow is as long as what casts it. As he sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, وَصَلَّى بِيَ الْعَصْرَ حِينَ كَانَ ظِلُّهُ مِثْلَهُ. He prayed Asr with me on the first day when the shadow was as long as what cast it. However, since any zenith shadow's length must be regarded, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, وَكَانَتْ قَدْرَ الشِّرَاكِ. The fate was as much as a sandal strap. And we already said that zenith shadow, how long is it going to be? Depends on the place and the season. So don't look for just one number. Rather, practice this. Do it yourself. Wallahu a'lam. We'll stop there. So we'll have a brief lesson tonight. Do you have any question I can answer for you? The fade is the shadow that turns towards the east, right as soon as basically when Dhuhr comes in. Because Dhuhr is when the sun declines into the west. So that when the sun declines into the west, that means the shadow is going to tilt over towards the east. So that swerving shadow, that's the fate. Barakallahu fikum.